Hello and welcome to today's lecture on future trends in international economics and cultural diplomacy. As the global financial crisis has demonstrated, the global economy influences all areas of our lives. It is intimately connected to issues such as global activity against climate change, extreme poverty, immigration and integration, healthcare, development, education, and culture and the arts. As such, discussion on the future of the global economy must incorporate perspectives from a diverse range of fields, including politics, civil society, and multiple academic disciplines such as sociology, philosophy, and anthropology. If the goal of international economics and cultural diplomacy is to promote stronger economic and cultural relations between nation-states, then the complex relationship between culture, economics, and politics must be examined at the global level. In this lecture, I will outline some of the most important developments we expect in the field of international economics and how cultural diplomacy will influence these developments. The most important significant change that has occurred in the field of international economics and cultural diplomacy is the question of who is making the decisions. The trend that we can observe is that the traditional elites from economic, political, and legislative sectors are no longer able to act independently of the will of the people, or their customers or clients. And the quote-unquote masses and the private citizens have a much stronger voice in dictating international economics, international politics, and international law. The processes of globalization, rapid advancement of technology, and the information revolutions have in many ways, all three, created a borderless world through trade, tourism, movement of labor and people, the ability to instantly globally communicate. In the new world, governments and traditional elites are less relevant and effective, dictatorships virtually impossible, and people, individuals, and communities more influential in creating new communities driven by common values and interests. New empires have been born, such as the empire of Facebook, with a population or user base of 900 million people. We are still undergoing this groundbreaking revolution, barely comprehending its full ramifications for the world at large and for the individual. The social networks have become even more influential than mighty armies. See Tahrir Square in Egypt and the Arab Spring. As one reflects on the current developments in the global economy, we observe major developments that have revolutionized the world completely, and therefore influence the future field of international economics and cultural diplomacy. These changes are primarily due to the revolution in the field of information and communication, as a means of explaining the framework for the future trends in international economics and cultural diplomacy. Allow me to briefly explain these major developments. The outline for today's lecture, as you can see, is first of all, I would like to give you a little bit of a background right now, the evolution of the global economy, what kind of a framework we actually are working in. Then I would like to illustrate for you three trends that we've observed in the field of international economics and what we predict will be coming in the years to come. The first trend is the great significance of the cultural factor. The second trend, the great significance of the fields of human rights and ethics. And the third trend, emergence of totally new products and services that are reformed to the benefit of society. And then finally, I will offer a few words of conclusion. First of all, as we look at this question, the evolution of the global economy, I'd like to demonstrate three things that I think have changed or that are new that make this period quite remarkable. First of all, within this revolution of the field of information and communication, we've seen a speed of communication, unlike no speed that we've had before, level of access to communication, unlike before, and I would argue that the digital divide is now over. And then finally, the amount of information that we have access to is also much greater than before. Let me outline these points one by one. In the past half-decade, since the Second World War, the world has witnessed an explosion in the field of information and communication. The first important component of this explosion is the speed in which information is shared. Currently, thanks to mobile phones, smartphones, and the internet, information and news is shared immediately over the spectrum of the entire globe. This change makes it necessary for all actors in the field of international economics to be aware that every failure, as well as every success that they have, can be instantaneously shared with the entire world within a period of seconds. This makes cultural diplomacy engagement of both the public and private sectors in the field of economics all the more paramount. The more involved these institutions are with cultural diplomacy activity, the closer they will be to their clients, the investors, and their partners, and therefore they will be able to respond much faster than their needs or demands. And as you can see on the slide, you have institutions such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook that really give the power to immediately send this information back and forth. So you can have a tweet about the reforms or lack of reforms that a country or a company does, really updated by the second. So that's the first point I really want to underline. This aspect of speed is really quite new, especially as we look back 10, 20, 30 years. Second major point, or the second important component of this explosion, is the level of access to information that individuals and institutions currently have. Before the internet and the mobile phone, an extremely limited group of individuals in the world were able to communicate with others outside of their local communities, and access to this communication was usually very expensive. This was commonly referred to as the digital divide. Today, I would argue that the digital divide is over. An article in April of 2010 in the New York Times already announced at that time, with the number of mobile phone subscriptions exceeding 5 billion, more people today have access to cell phones than to a clean toilet. Farmers in Nigeria use cell phones to find out which market is giving the best price. People in Kenya pay their bills and send money home using M-Pesa. Now, with widespread usage of mobile phone and access to the internet, even in developing countries, combined with technologies such as social media, it becomes possible, even for the rural farmer in a small town in the desert of the Sahara, to communicate instantly with millions of other individuals. The best proof of this is the recent Arab Spring, where this technology enabled the masses of citizens to actually topple dictatorships. And in that sense, they were stronger than the great Egyptian army, one could say, in terms of power. Now that the digital divide is over, actors in the field of international economics must make use of this access to communicate with every citizen of the world in the framework of their advertising and public relations campaigns, as well as in their cultural diplomacy engagement. In addition, there is the possibility today to communicate directly with anyone, even a head of state, via electronic or social media. This was impossible 50 years ago, and one had to go through heavy bureaucratic infrastructures, such as ambassadors, secretaries, etc., before even coming close to being able to communicate with the head of state. Now you can send an email to President Obama, and he's actually keeping us informed on an hourly basis of the activities of the White House. So really, that's a direct level of communication that was really not possible 5, 10 years ago. The third relevant component of the explosion in the field of information and communication is the amount of information that is currently available to average citizens, as well as the public and private sectors, has increased immensely. This is for two primary reasons. Firstly, because technology allows us to access much more information digitally than was traditionally available in printed archives. And two, societies are demanding more disclosure and transparency from the public sector, private sector, and civil society organizations. Regarding the second point, as we can see in the case of WikiLeaks, or the work of Transparency International, more and more information is expected to be disclosed by international firms, which is adding as well to the information overload, which we find becoming more and more the case in the field of international economics. In summary, the main actors in the field of international economics, namely the public and private sectors, must adapt to this expansion of the magnitude of information that is made public, and must proactively publish this information themselves before the information is taken violently through organizations such as WikiLeaks, or before there are public protests on the streets demanding disclosure of this information. The practice of cultural diplomacy can assist in the framework of the revolution of the field of information and communication by enabling public and private sector actors to communicate in better ways and more regularly with their important stakeholders. What I'd like to do now that we've painted, let's say, the picture or gone over the context of international economics and why I think this period is quite exceptional and quite unique, I would now like to outline 3 trends that we've observed. Those trends are, and these are trends in the field of international economics and cultural diplomacy. These trends are, 1, the great significance of the cultural factor, 2, the great significance of the fields of human rights and ethics, and 3, emergence of totally new products and services that are reformed for the benefit of society. Allow me to explain them below the points. First of all, the great significance of the cultural factor. In the future field of international economics, we will see much more adaptation in economic policies and strategies, which will be revised because of cultural factors. In other words, the cultural factor will influence more the ways in which companies and countries conduct business, trade, and investment. For example, in the past, the EU would offer development aid to countries in Africa. However, they would require that country make certain reforms first. This is one thing for a country like Switzerland. However, of course, a very different thing for a country such as Rwanda or Uganda, which have very different cultural, much greater cultural differences with their European partners. China, on the other hand, offers similar support and development aid to the same countries without making any such demands. Therefore, in many ways, China's respect for local cultures and traditions in African countries are making China a much more attractive partner for African countries than Europe. The same is true for private sector companies that either do proper research about a country or market's culture or do not when entering this market with their products or services. Even though these policies are to be created and adapted by the private sector, it is up to civil society to enforce them. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit more in depth about, let's say, the recognition of the cultural factor in an interdependent world. As referred to earlier, the international system of the contemporary world, and even more so in the future, is based on the model of global interdependence as opposed to independence. The thesis of interdependence is most famously articulated by the American scholar and activist Benjamin Barber. As you can see on the screen, this is his main thesis. The old aspiration was independence. The new reality, interdependence. Every challenge we face today, from climate and crime to technology and markets, and communications and public health, is global in character. Yet the institutions of democracy we rely on to address these challenges are still locked up inside sovereign states pursuing the old logic of independence. But in an interdependent world of diseases without borders, we also need citizens without borders, democracy without borders, which means if we are to survive interdependence and flourish in liberty, we must either globalize democracy or democratize globalization. I think this is a very important thesis that really influences, in my opinion, not only international economics, but actually all policies of the world. Let's give you one example from the field of cultural diplomacy that we've referred to in previous lectures. A classical example of cultural diplomacy would be, let's say, the French government's promoting French culture abroad through the Alliance Française. Let's say promoting the French language, offering concerts, offering exhibitions of French culture in other European countries. If we agree with Barber's thesis of interdependence, that really seems so trivial, right? If we imagine, let's say, every country just trying to promote their own culture abroad, that's not really going to help the group or the team. You could argue the European Union is a team, and if they actually play together well, that team will succeed. In order for them to play together well, they don't just need to promote each other's cultures back and forth. They need trust, and they need understanding. And even though it's important to promote your cultures in the sense that others can learn from it, much more important is understanding and trust. So that's one example, really, where cultural diplomacy of the future, I think, has to be reflective of this interdependence philosophy. Just like for private sector companies, as well as for governments. In the sense, it's not enough just to promote your national interest when it comes to climate change. You've got to deal with also the interdependent situation. Climate change is not something that just affects you as a nation, but it affects all of us. And climate change is not something that you as a nation can solve yourself. You have to solve it together in partnership with the other countries as well. So again there, when it comes to policies, I think automatically the policies of the future, politically speaking, need to be also interdependent in nature, as I would argue the case is with international economics. If it's just every company competing with another company in terms of making money, etc., pursuing their own priorities that actually profit for themselves, they're going to first of all destroy the international system, and secondly make it very difficult for cooperation. So I believe the private sector as well needs to have more cooperation and really move more interdependently in the future. So in that sense, I think the cultural factor is very, very important. We need to figure out how we actually can work together. We understand and respect each other's cultures with the ultimate goal of having cooperation in the economic, the cultural, and the political fields. I agree that the world is currently an interdependent one. And if you agree as well, then this means the policies of each sector, public, private, and civil society, will need to be modified so that they reflect not a policy based on the independent, individual interests of the country, company, or organization, but rather the interdependent interests of their competitors as well. To give one example, one country alone is not able to solve the problem of global warming, as I mentioned, and therefore the national policy, developed by one country alone and operating independently, would be of little use unless it was carefully coordinated with other countries of the world. Therefore, a national policy towards global warming of the future should rather be a collaborative policy of many countries that is designed collectively and executed collectively in order to make a significant difference in solving the problem. For private sector firms, it is the same, and companies must coordinate their engagement in the field of corporate social responsibility as well as corporate culture diplomacy in order to increase the overall efficiency for society as well as the return on investment. Accepting global interdependence means accepting cooperation with partners around the world in every segment of society. And I think here, just to push this further, I would say really also at some point competitors need to get together. If every oil company has their own CSR policy and their own CSR projects, it's going to be very difficult to, again, move together collectively as an interdependent world. So I think even in the case where you have competitors in the same field, especially in those cases, I would say you've got to find a way, at least in terms of CSR, to work together, to collaborate. This is typically a very difficult thing to do, especially with competitors, because you have a lot of issues there in terms of trust, etc. So I think in terms of the business models, of course, those always have to stay separate. But when it comes to the CSR, as well as corporate culture diplomacy, there I see a chance for really companies to come together, and especially companies in the same sector. Then I think we really can move much quicker as a global situation to actually improve the situation for society. The next point I'd like to make is the cultural factor and the role of the public sector, and in particular, economic global governance institutions and governments. In the future, we will see increased regionalization and globalization trends, which will strengthen global governance institutions and gradually take more and more responsibility from national and local governments. The main task of a global governance institution will be to provide access to the resources and rights that their citizens demand, such as education, human rights, economic opportunities, and social rights. Countries are realizing that the less barriers, whether they're cultural or economic, that exist to free trade, the better. And we will see a deepening of organizations, such as the European Union in Europe, or Mercosur in Latin America. These regional organizations will allow for more trade and exchange to take place both within the regions and between the regions. Regarding cultural diplomacy, we expect to see much more engagement that was done by individual countries to promote their national interests. And we see that these national policies promoting just their own interests become futile in the interdependent context. Therefore, we expect to see more modern practices of cultural diplomacy that facilitate greater access to individual cultures, as opposed to the classical practices, which were designed to promote specific images of a country's culture or their identity in terms of nation branding. This is what you should think of Germany. This is what you should think of the USA. Those policies really seem to be the policies of the past. The new policies really do seem to be, how do we facilitate access? How do we make it easier to access each other's cultures or markets? And I think there you see a parallel in international economics and also international cultural policies. The trend, in terms of economics seems to be more liberalization, making it easier for us to trade, bringing down trade barriers, whether it's on a regional level or the international level. Culturally speaking, it's actually the same pattern. And I think there, in many ways, the economic strategies and reforms are being reflected in the cultural. And I think that should continue that way. And in the end, really, the cultural diplomacy strategies can go hand in hand with the economic strategies, where in the end we're at a global level, making this trade and investments easier to flow over borders, as well as also cultural exchange to flow over those borders. The newer forms of cultural diplomacy will enable greater understanding and trust between countries, which will in turn improve the relationship as a whole, allowing for further trade and economic activity between the individual countries involved in cultural diplomacy engagement, as well as the other countries that will engage with them. In addition, it will be expected that global governance institutions, such as the UN, are reformed in order to allow them to intervene efficiently and without bureaucratic hurdles when urgent human rights violations, such as the current situation of Syria, occur in the world. The global governance, cultural diplomacy engagement, and economic development strategies will be designed in a way that will help to prevent human rights violations, to allow them to intervene quickly if violations occur, and that allow for reconciliation to take place in post-conflict situations. The inability to take action that we are currently witnessing with the crisis in Syria and the paralyzed United Nations will no longer be tolerated. Finally, examples such as the Arab Spring underline for us that ineffective governance institutions, whether they are national, multinational, or global, will no longer be tolerated, and citizens will stand up to either topple these institutions, such as the case in the Arab Spring countries. This will force both national governments, democracies, as well as other forms of governments, as well as global governance institutions, to improve their performance significantly in order to preserve their existence. And this is where I think the cultural diplomacy can assist. The more cultural diplomacy activities the King of Morocco does with the Moroccan citizens, the more likely it is he can stay in touch with his citizens and avoid a violent protest, as was the case in Egypt or Tunisia. In many ways, there's the thesis in Morocco that the reason why one has the stability that one has there is due to the closeness and to the activity between the king and the people. Very active. You also have more of a call and a response. The people will make demands, and there will be a response from the government, which was not the case when it came to Tunisia or Egypt. So that's, again, a classical case where I think cultural diplomacy can assist. The same thing with companies in the private sector. So it's a very important factor to be underlined. Speaking of the private sector, that's the next point that I wanted to make. The cultural factor and private sector firms. As can be witnessed by movements such as Occupy Wall Street, the public is demanding that private sector firms act more responsibly and transparently. For a long period of time, it appeared that the private sector firms enjoyed a certain immunity to public pressure and demands. In this previous time, the way in which a company operated, regarding the treatment of its workers, the profit that was earned by the executives, and the way in which it respected or did not respect the environment, was a very separate field than the way in which the firm was perceived by the public and presented to the public. In many cases, it was possible for a firm to operate in a very unethical way. However, the public did not know this, and the company was able to present a very positive image for itself in the public via advertising. In many cases, the perception of a company was much better than it should have been, given the unethical behavior of the company. Today, the international environment has already changed substantially, and private sector firms are forced to, quote, practice what they preach when it comes to their business practices and corporate culture diplomacy. Through the social media and modern technology, the public and the consumers have much better access to information about the behavior of companies, both nationally and abroad. And therefore, companies must improve their business practices significantly in order to avoid backlash, such as Occupy Wall Street. In addition, by private sector firms engaging more in corporate culture diplomacy, the firms have the possibility to strengthen their relationships with their clients, their investors, and the public as a whole, which will help the firm to solidify their trust and both help to avoid any potential backlash from the public, as well as attracting these stakeholders and the public to the firm itself, as well as the products or services. Having outlined the contemporary global situation, let us imagine that the process of globalization will continue to evolve in a similar pattern, and increased access to information and communication, increased awareness, and the intervention in the field of universal rights succeeds at establishing a functioning international system. What can we expect from global governance institutions and from the private sector and civil society in the field of international economics and cultural diplomacy? Allow us to offer several predictions. But first, let me mention one more sector that I think is very relevant: the cultural factor and civil society. Civil society will need to adapt to the cultural factor in similar ways. On the one hand, within national borders, it is becoming clear for the need for further cultural dialogue and exchange, as cities and countries get more and more multicultural. A direct result of globalization is that citizens are not only traveling more than ever, but they are also moving to live and work in other countries more than ever as well. This is creating a need for civil society engagements to ease this transition in national populations as they get more multicultural. In addition, there is a growing need for civil society engagement in the international arena, as well as the stronger the cultural bridge between countries and regions, the easier it will be for economic bridges to remain stable, to grow, and to deepen. Two interesting examples here would be Germany and the United Arab Emirates. Germany is a country that traditionally didn't have such big waves of migration until around the 60s and 70s, when they then included and invited actually guest workers from around the world. This brought a big wave of actually foreigners to Germany, in particular the Turkish diaspora, which actually the largest Turkish diaspora in the world, outside of Turkey, is here in Germany. That presents a challenge for Germany in the sense, what is German identity? How does Germany open up to these cultures or not? And that's one of the debates taking place today. How can one properly integrate, let's say, these foreigners into Germany? But it's really a two-way street. Not that we basically melt, like the melting pot idea, we melt these cultures into some German soup, but how do we really mix together these cultures in more of a mixed salad form? That would be one example where I think there's a great need also for civil society to get engaged in terms of the cultural factor. Another example would be, again, for economic reasons. United Arab Emirates now has more foreigners living in the United Arab Emirates than actually citizens. So there's actually more people who are not citizens of the United Arab Emirates living there than the actual Emiratis themselves, for, again, economic reasons. So you see here really this interplay between international economics and cultural diplomacy. The workers, and basically most of the individuals who are working in the United Arab Emirates, come from Pakistan, India, all over the world, whereas a much smaller population there is in control of many of those industries. So again, another situation where it's so extreme there, there are actually more foreigners than national citizens. Again, an opportunity for cultural diplomacy really to help ease this international economic situation as it's expressed in cities like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, etc., and the United Arab Emirates. Let me move now to the second trend that we've observed in the field of international economics and cultural diplomacy. The great significance of the field of human rights and ethics. The fields of human rights and ethics have always been of vital importance to citizens around the world. However, due to the increased access to information and communication in today's globalized world, citizens today are much better informed about human rights violations, and we are informed about these violations much earlier than ever before. This is causing the public sector institutions to reduce the number of human rights violations that they commit, and is causing private sector firms to do the same. In addition, private sector firms are expected today to engage in corporate social responsibility, and discussions of private sector is expected to behave responsible when it comes to human rights as well. Therefore, it is much more difficult in the current global context of far greater access to news, the birth of citizen journalism and blogs, where every citizen in the world has the potential and the power to publish news and reports about human rights violations, ethical problems within governments or companies, or any other news developments immediately as they develop. Take a picture on your iPhone, email it to your YouTube accounts or to your Twitter account or Facebook, and suddenly it's international media. Cultural diplomacy will influence the general policies of companies and countries, the rules and laws of the general policies, as well as how they are specifically implemented. The quote-unquote reasonable person or citizen around the world will demand that these strategies are ethical strategies and respectful of fundamental human rights. I'll give you one example. One prime example is in February 2012, when Apple Computer was forced to publicly admit that it had a human rights problem within factories in China from the producer called Foxconn that were producing the iPad and the iPod. Workers in these factories were actively committing suicide due to the, quote, inhumane conditions, and this created a clear backlash and negative press about Apple Computer around the world. Apple's response was fast and transparent, and this helped to avoid a more severe backlash against the company, and already by August of 2012, the conditions in Foxconn had drastically improved. After a detailed audit of the Fair Labor Association, Foxconn made 284 changes and improvements regarding the workers' conditions. Of course, the best thing a company can do to avoid such a situation is to make sure there are no human rights violations to begin with, and in any of its offices or factories or that of its producers. In addition, however, if Apple had been engaged with corporate cultural activities in China and the communities where the factories were based, they would have known about these problems much earlier, and they would have solved them before the media exploited the case. In addition, the more cultural diplomacy engagement that Apple had invested in within these communities, the better relations and trust there would have been, which would have served as a foundation, making it easier to negotiate with the local community and stakeholders to create a better relationship as a whole, which could automatically generate better public relations in the first place. So again, just to summarize, of course, companies should avoid the human rights violations to begin with. But a second thing that should always be done, really as a daily activity, is the corporate cultural diplomacy. Whatever that engagement is, whether it's doing activities, cultural activities, exchange programs, offering cultural opportunities for the workers, for the factories, any kind of engagement like that, which the company decides is appropriate, can really help. It opens up another channel of discussion, another channel of dialogue. It's a way for those local communities to get to know the big corporation, who maybe they've never even met. And it's a way for the big corporation to also have an ear to the streets, so they see what is actually happening on the ground in these factories, in these situations. So a prime example where I think cultural diplomacy can really help establish a base of stability for companies, and also to protect them against possible backlash in the future. Of course, the public sector and civil society must abide by the very same norms and expectations. The difference is that it is easier for the private sector and civil society to be controlled, because they must abide by the laws of the countries in which they operate. In addition, in the case of the private sector, consumers have the freedom to choose either to purchase the products or the services or not. In the case of the public sector, of course, it is much more difficult, as we see in the case of Syria. Even when there is a clear and very extreme violation of human rights, the international community is not able to intervene, unless the United Nations Security Council agrees that it should intervene. As we all know, even though almost all countries in the UN do agree to intervene, the veto of Russia and China are making the UN paralyzed. Nevertheless, we are clearly witnessing the growing significance of human rights and ethics on each sector of society in international economics. So in that sense, I think it'll never be like it was before in terms of human rights violations being hidden, etc. It's really just a matter of time, and that window of time is getting shorter and shorter every day before the world learns about these violations and when they occur. So in that sense, I think it's a good thing in the sense that it should be getting more and more difficult for violations to take place from the government point of view, private sector point of view, or civil society. The third trend that I would like to outline is the emergence of totally new products and services that are formed to the benefit of society. The final future trend that we expect in the field of international economics is that the products and services which consumers purchase in the future will be influenced by the two future trends that we just reviewed: the cultural factor and human rights and ethics. Consumers will demand that their fellow consumers and the producers and service providers, quote-unquote, practice what they preach. They will expect that the products should be reflective of their official policies. We have witnessed this in the automotive industry, for example, where it is not enough for companies to express the importance of fighting global warming and climate change in their advertisements, but consumers expect them to produce cars that are less destructive to the environment, and consumers expect that the production processes of the cars itself will also be more efficient and less destructive to the environment. Not too long ago, when one saw a television ad for new cars, the advertisements would emphasize how fast or powerful the car was. Today, it is almost the opposite, and we across the board. And the car advertisements advertise how efficient and environmentally friendly the cars are. We see the huge success of the hybrid cars in the international market, and we're starting to see the emergence of electric cars as well. This phenomenon will continue to infiltrate every single product or service which is sold in the world. Consumers will expect that the products they buy are not harmful to the environment, are healthy, and are produced in a way that respects the cultural traditions of the human rights of all involved. Another example would be Starbucks, or in terms of also the fair traded coffee, where then really a lot of citizens really care. When they drink their coffee, how is this coffee actually produced? What human rights, what ethics were actually abided by or not? And the whole fair traded coffee trend is another example, where you really see people do pay attention, and a company such as Starbucks can earn money or lose money directly based upon the fact, the policies that they have in respect to human rights and beyond. Another example, recently I just saw this ad also on TV, is Puma. Puma is the sneaker company, and what they've done is they said to themselves, hey, what about packaging? Every time people buy a pair of shoes, there's the box as well as the plastic bag. Is that really necessary to have the plastic bag? So their new campaign right now is they have basically a hanging box. So essentially you hold onto it and the box itself, and you can reuse it. It's made out of cloth, so you can then use your Puma bag to then go grocery shopping, etc. So first of all, for the company, it's a great way of actually saving costs. They don't need to have the plastic bag plus the box. Secondly, it's a great way of showing they actually care about the environment, etc. Thirdly, it's great advertising, because every time you reuse your Puma bag and you go food shopping, you're doing advertising for Puma. So it's a brilliant idea where the company is actually saving money, increasing their profits, and increasing their advertising, and helping society all at the same time. So that's one example really where it's just a question of creativity very often. You don't necessarily need to pay more for environmentally friendly products. You don't need to necessarily pay more for coffee that's produced ethically as opposed to other coffee, but you do need to take that seriously and adapt. And the same thing with cars. You don't necessarily need to pay more to save money, or to help the environment. A lot of people are buying these hybrid cars because they want to save money. It's a lot less money they spend in gas every year. So in that sense, again, there's this myth that sort of, to have a good product or a product that's good for society automatically means paying more or giving something up. Not necessarily the case. So in that sense, I think it's an important myth that needs to be countered. To conclude the lecture, I would like to offer a few words to try to summarize what we've discussed with the previous examples. Cultural diplomacy will serve as the means to enable the private sector, the public sector, and civil society to cope with the above-mentioned trends and transitions in the field of international economics. The more in-depth and the more successful a company or a country's cultural diplomacy engagement at the local, national, and international level, the easier it will be to make sure that their policies are not in contradiction or in conflict with the cultures and societies that they are operating in. Cultural diplomacy engagement can help to prevent a backlash to a bad company or governmental policies, as expressed by such examples of Occupy Wall Street, destructive internet blogs or social media campaigns, or other kinds of destructive backlash which can damage companies and governments. In the future context of international economics, cultural diplomacy will become a requirement of the private sector and public sector policies and will influence the political, economic, and cultural relationships between countries, companies, and citizens in almost every facet of daily life. So in other words, really cultural diplomacy in the past was looked upon very often as a luxury. In the sense governments, first you have your economic policies, your political policies. If you have time, you could do cultural diplomacy. The Americans did a lot of cultural diplomacy in the Cold War, where they saw it was important, and then they stopped doing cultural diplomacy in a large extent. They said, okay, we don't need it now. I think this is all changing. And the point we're trying to make in this lecture is we look at the future field of international economics. Everyone will have to engage in corporate cultural diplomacy, or some sort of cultural diplomacy. They may call it something different. They may call it the CSR, corporate social responsibility. They may actually just practice it as part of their policies, as opposed to doing a separate cultural diplomacy engagement. They may actually just operate in a more culturally sensitive way. Typically, the private sector is the fastest to learn these lessons because there they can directly feel it in terms of earning money or not. One example of that would be Disneyland. When Disneyland expanded to France, they said, okay, Disneyland works in the USA, it works in Asia, let's do it in France the same way. They didn't do any research, they didn't do any preparations, they just built Disneyland in Paris, and they tried it, and it failed. For the first 3.5 years, Disneyland lost money. Basically because of cultural reasons. They didn't actually do the proper research. They tried to adapt to the French identity first, and they served red wine at the McDonald's. Didn't work. They then finally adapted to what they called the European identity, where they had the signs in 5 or 6 different languages. They had more diverse kinds of food. They had little bowls for dogs, because many of the Parisians or Europeans like also to bring dogs into the parks. And a whole series of changes. It costed them 3.5 years of loss before they adapted in such a way that their product, in this case a cultural product, really fit in the French context. So that's one example where, again, a company really directly can be hurt by not practicing cultural diplomacy or taking the proper steps to show cultural sensitivity for the markets they're engaging in. Public sector and civil society, we've given these examples again. So that's the main transition that we see as we observe these 3 future trends in the field of international economics, where cultural diplomacy will no longer be a luxury, but will actually be a requirement. And it will hopefully not only be a separate policy that companies do in addition to their activities, but it'll actually be a part of the business plan, a part of the development strategy from the beginning. And they'll come up with really comprehensive plans and comprehensive strategies for the company to succeed and actually earn more money, for the country to succeed and also better serve their citizens, as well as for the civil society organizations also to succeed. So really across the board, we see this as a major change and a major development. I hope that these reflections were useful to you, and I hope that I've gotten you thinking a little bit about the vast potential that there is for cultural diplomacy in the future field of international economics, and some of the trends that we observe have already started and will continue to take place over the coming 10, if not 20 years. Thank you very much for your attention.